That's it, that's the only joke I'm gonna make. It's serious business from now on. I was planning to do a review on Axiom's End and the sequel before I realized how dense they would be to read, and by the time I had finished the second book, I had realized that everything that I could say about it was exactly what I was already going to say about the first book. So I'm not gonna talk about it. So that ended up being, in the scope of my job, a complete waste of my not precious time. Thankfully, the monetary loss was more than made up for by the street cred I got on the playground once people realized I read 2 dense sci-fi books. I'm the coolest kid on the block, cool with a K, kid with a C. So let's start there. Axiom's End. Axiom meaning a statement or assumption that is held to be true, as it is a requirement for conversation or argument, and end meaning end, as in I'm going to end the sentence now. Both it and the sequel, obviously, were written by Lindsay Ellis, who has made videos on the topic. Watch if you want. I have forgotten what it feels like to desire something, so I'm just going to keep making this video. First off, if dense sci-fi books or stories that use science fiction as a way to raise questions on what it means to be alive, or why we do the things we do, or think the way that we do, then this is not the book for you. Just straight up. It's an incredibly strange experience that I'm not going to forget anytime soon. I'm also not going to understand it anytime soon. Any broad statement I make feels disingenuous. The book's main character is Cora Sabine, but it's also just, like humans and humanity as a concept. It's multifaceted enough that not laying out the entire plot as it happens would always leave out something that is integral. Going in based off the blurb, the book more than surprised me, with both the direction and depth of its story, as they exceeded my expectations, which admittedly, is pretty new for me. You're telling me that things were better than I thought they were gonna be. You know what this means? It's a trick meant for me to lower my guard. You're never gonna take me alive. I figured, given the description, that the book would be about finding her father because of some gnosis or MacGuffin that he has, hijinks ensue, lessons learnt, aliens met. However, it turned out to be a lot more focused on hitting you hard and fast with the aliens, and then developing that into discussing the differences and similarities between as many parts as of both sides that the book is actually able to do. It does a really good job of describing something about the aliens in a way that sounds completely insane, which is parroted by someone in the story, at which point the alien just hits them with, "Yeah, but your society makes no sense either," and then does a sick kickflip. I am paraphrasing in case you didn't notice. The aliens are also, thankfully, alien. Many interpretations of aliens in pop culture is pretty similar to how they treat animals, which is, it's a dog but big, and aliens are just humans but weird. These aliens are barely comprehensible, and occasionally there just, isn't an easy analogy to make. Sometimes there is common ground. Other times they're just fundamentally different, and there are barriers. They are significantly more advanced and intelligent than humans, but speaking a completely foreign language like English is repeatedly brought up as a challenge, like it literally would be. The amount of contrivances the book makes to get the story going is pretty minimal. There isn't a scene where a character is just like, oh, well, the alien language is just, a mix between Spanish, Mandarin, and Latin. That doesn't happen. They are genuinely difficult to decipher, and the problems they face are pretty real. I really do recommend this book, basically blind. I really don't want to spoil too much of it, but one issue I did have is that it takes a bit longer than I would have liked to really start rolling, and a lot of the book at the end is really dry if you don't care about the characters, but I did, and I imagine you would too. Speaking of weird, you. This is an excellent point to bring up ghostwriters. Not for any reason, I just think it would be fun. While it is natural for you to assume that everything that you read passes through only the hand and mind of the name on the front, the truth is never really that simple. In order to create a complete written work, it's often necessary for at least one other person to read over or contribute to the manuscript. My videos are entirely created by me, That's why they suck. That's not even really a joke, because without third-party oversight, how funny my videos are is directly related to how emotionally prepared I am to obliterate crockery. I don't think you'd be surprised to find out that when you're questioning your self-worth and your decisions, the part of your brain that makes people laugh is kind of a bit busy. A ghostwriter is a pretty good way to make sure that the ebbs and flows of someone's mood, as normal and expected as they are, do not reduce the quality of a product that may exist forever in a single state, like a book or a criminal record. A ghostwriter being able to stay objective in the face of emotion is important, just not in this case. Jake doesn't really seem to have them. On the other hand, ghostwriters are integral when someone has something worth saying, but do not have the tools to express that. Scientists are an excellent example of this. You can be the preeminent mind in your field, but you probably don't even know what a semicolon is. This book embodies the worst of both, because a ghostwriter truly can't surpass the person they're writing for, as they just shape the words, and Jake Paul has nothing worth saying or thinking, let alone yelling. To say this book didn't need to exist is a dramatic understatement. I usually determine that by looking at what the book tries to achieve, and if it does so, to what extent. I don't know what this book is trying to accomplish, and I can safely say it gets nowhere close. You would think based off the title, You Gotta Want It, that it's gonna be about his success and how that success came to be, which is probably technically true, but in reality what you read is more or less a chronological retelling of his life, with the stories mostly being tangentially related to his later success. However, sometimes the stories just aren't related at all. That statement is also being partially disingenuous, seeing as the book isn't just stories. There are these weird interludes that barely make sense and add nothing. Thankfully, they don't interrupt the story, since the story sucks and it has the flow of an above-ground pool that's been empty for 12 years. It's like watching paint dry, but every so often someone turns off the lights. It's less of an interruption and more of like a new way to experience my own boredom. One of the times the book had me genuinely enthralled was when Jake regales the reader with his opinions on girls, because for some reason, intentionally, he speaks about his past crushes in the past tense, but he still speaks about them in the way that he used to think of them, as if he was taking excerpts directly from his diary or something. Like, he uses words and makes statements that would be much less concerning if it were to come from a pubescent boy that is in the same demographic as the person he is speaking about. It's not a crime, and realistically, it doesn't even mean anything about his character, but from a literary point of view, it's just weird. Like, it's really easy to not talk about how hot you thought the chicks in your life were about half a decade after you knew them in very specific detail. It's also really boring, so I'm not sure why you decided to do it. Oh, yeah, also it goes without saying, but it makes him kind of look like a tiny little inch, misogynistic. Like, not any bit over what he normally looks like, but this just reinforces that. 10 out of 10, I love it. You know what they say? Reading is magic. They just never said what kind. I feel terrible for whoever had to read and fix his work. I'm certain they exist, mind you, because I at no point believed that the man who wrote this also used the word beguile. It's a great word. I love it. However, it's even used correctly, so he probably didn't write it. I don't think Jake Paul is illiterate. I just don't think he cares. Another thing that confuses me is the target demographic. Much of the book, as previously discussed, seems aimed at teenage boys. But there's also a chapter on things about boys, so that part's clearly aimed at teenage girls, but only this page. I can't help but imagine that teenage girls might be a little bit off-put by him. I could be wrong though. I don't know if you've noticed, I'm not actually a teenage girl. I can't speak for... I'm not their leader. I don't speak for them. It's especially strange given the fact that he really doubles down on the parts of his life that you really shouldn't, like here, where he admires his dad, but for kind of like the... Not the wrong reasons, but really not the best ones. Not the ones that you would say, he's my hero, this is why. Usually it's like, he's brave, he's smart, he's a hard worker. Not like, Yeah, he had so many women clinging to it. It's just weird. I don't like. It's kind of gross. Also, if you were worried that his weird grind set motto didn't make it into these pages, then buddy, you're really stupid. This book is packed to the brim with platitudes and stories about how to be successful that would be impossible to decipher in that way if Jake didn't explicitly spell it out. Not only is all this information useless, it paints him in a truly pathetic and unlikable way. He appears conceited, arrogant, childish, and vapid many times throughout the book, and then it just ends. Just like real life. Lastly, the book has aged horrendously. Many of the things he's talking about as future projects that will define his career and his life now no longer exist at all, have failed, or in a terrible state of limbo, most of them barely lasting a year, and everything in the past that he talks about didn't matter then, and matters less now. Good Mythical Morning, YouTube channel starring Rhett and Link, and also an excellent phrase to scream out the window at 5 AM. Rhett and Link have published 2 books actually, the first focused on them and the channel, and the second being a mystery novel. Now, while the first is good and might very well be the absolute best, read this if you are interested in ex-YouTuber type of book, I like the second one more, so I'm gonna be reading that one. It focuses mostly on 2 childhood friends, Rex and Leif, along with the people that surround them. It is simply put, a fictional retelling of Rhett and Link's childhood, with certain parts being exaggerated in order to fill the needs of certain elements for the supernatural mystery plot. In the past, I've spoken about why authors often take elements from their real life and base the plot of the novel around them. This is by far the best example of it that I have ever read. The story is set in 1992 in a small southern town that is heavily religious, and the book spends almost no time explicitly describing the setting because it absolutely does not have to. There are countless sentences that are just dripping with implications that make it clear that they have a lot to say about both religion and the way it interacts with a town where it has become intrinsically linked to said town. The type of place where even the thought of leaving is sin enough, where religion creates an air of strictness and conformity that then molds the type of people that the church is so eager to admonish, whose power structure that relies on public shame is as equally invincible and eternal as it is fragile, only existing because not enough people understand the damage it does to those it targets, or because too few care. It was immediately apparent to me, based off a very limited understanding of the book's authors, that this wasn't just based on a setting they had experienced, but one that they had an incredibly deep and complicated emotional tie to. You probably already know this. I've seen their content before and knew that they were childhood friends from the South, but the extent that their lives are reflected in this book is honestly pretty astounding. This is evident if you've listened to Rhett's music, specifically Believe Me, excellent song, which stands out, but pretty much all of the music relates to his past crisis of faith and current relationship with God that he details in the video Rhett's Spiritual Deconstruction. And yes, Link also has one, you can watch that too. After watching both of them, and the video where they speak about their late childhood friend Ben, who is a character in the book, video which I highly recommend by the way, it became pretty clear how much this novel means to them. Putting aside the differences in grammar, fundamentally this book has a surprising amount in common with the writings of Axiom, of all people, being that both are, in a basic sense, a wish fulfillment fictional retelling of the author's lives, except unlike Axiom, instead of making themselves smarter, braver, better liked, full of incredibly awesome comebacks, or 6 feet tall at like 14 years old, they wanted their novel versions to be nicer. And it's not even by that much. They're not like the Golden Children or anything like that. They're not praised or whatever. They're still outcasts. They're just like slightly better. In their video about Ben, Rhett says, "I wish we could have spent a different kind of time that's opposed to trying to convince him of something that I don't even believe anymore." And you really get the feeling reading those parts with Ben, which I did before watching the video, and afterwards it became clear that they focused in on what they now remember fondly and then brought that to life. I've omitted any specifics of the story because I don't even want to spoil like anything past the first chapter or two. To put it simply, Rex and Leif's friend gets carted off to a Christian reform school, basically, after they cause trouble, and we follow their attempts to get their friend out, and through that we learn about the town, its history, and the people around it. It is an excellently paced story with beautiful themes and great, well-defined characters. I highly recommend it. And even beyond just being a good book, it's a really good piece of art. They have a lot to say about the book's themes, and I'm not entirely comfortable simplifying any of it. What I will say is, it is by far my favorite book out of any of the ones I've covered across both videos. It is earnest and endearing. It balances a lighthearted tone with creepy imagery very well. The characters feel completely real, and I was invested from the absolute start to the last page. I was there the whole way. There are follow-up videos to their respective spiritual deconstructions that I also recommend. And Link's understanding and relationship with faith as a concept is probably more complicated and mature than most people will ever be able to understand, and this book very much feels like a product of that. Like, it feels like something they didn't want to write, but needed to. And in a hard turn back to the middle of the road, Girl Online by Zoe Sugg. Time has not been kind to her name. Now, everyone who's read this book probably just got insane whiplash from going from one of the best books I've ever read to this. Cards on the table. I only read this book because I felt like I needed something to fill in the gap left in the script by removing truth of the divine, and as is my nature, when faced with a multitude of good choices on bookstores, I picked the worst one. That's not saying the book is bad. It's not poorly written, difficult to read, or completely devoid of positive traits. There's just not much to talk about. Like, it's not a discussion-worthy book. Now, not every book needs to be able to contend for a neighborhood's weekly book club discussions. However, if they aren't discussion-worthy, my video is shorter and I get paid less. Overall, book's fine. I haven't read the sequels. I probably will at some point. It's not too much of a commitment. Girl Online took exactly as much time to read as it should, meaning like a few hours, but I kept putting it off because it's just really not my type of book. I think if you like rom-coms, you'll like this book. If you want them to be good, then probably not. Our main character Penny feels real enough, as does her friend Elliot and the love interest Noah. Most of the characters, apart from that, aren't that deep, but they have the traits that fit to stereotypes that you can just kind of imagine. For instance, Ollie, the first love interest, is entirely superficial. Her old friend, Megan, is a bully and habitual gossip. Noah's younger sister, Bella, immediately takes a liking to Penny and constantly makes it known how much Noah likes her, etc., etc. You've probably seen this all before, even if you're blind. What did surprise me is how quickly everything was moving, and also how circular everything was moving. Everything on the back of the book happens at such a rapid pace, you might have missed how much she actually does between the 1st and 16th chapter. Penny has an entire romantic setup with Ollie, kind of fights with Megan, blogs several times, gets embarrassed in front of the entire school, at the same time that her family gets an all-expense-paid trip to New York for a wedding client and meets... they're just like immediately falling in love. It's so hard to describe. The rest of the blurb relates to Noah's secret, which only comes into play at almost the end of the book, which brings me to really the only like massive issue I had when reading this, which is that the relationship between Noah and Penny comes on really strong and rapidly. Like, they're basically in love with each other by the 3rd time they've met, and they're maxed out for the rest of the book. Unfortunately, there's still like 20 chapters left, and our characters have reached the logical conclusion of their story and no longer need to exist. It's not too big of an issue, but I don't think either of these characters are interesting, and when there's no possibility of anything happening anymore, and the chapters are being held up solely by their dialogue, I want to throw a brick at something. Spoilers, but after Penny goes to New York and starts falling for Noah, it puts a strain on her friendship with Elliot, and after she goes back home to Brighton, she is white. It comes out that Noah had a girlfriend, they break it off, but actually the girlfriend was fake for publicity, they stay together, that's the entire book. It's pretty corny sometimes, but it's completely fine. And I'm not one to mess with the status quo, so let's continue downwards. and Crash. KSI, I Am a Bellend. One of the worst books I've ever read. First and foremost, it's really boring. Like, it's not a novel, mind you, or an autobiography, so it's more of a mix between a little bit of autobiography and a lot of pamphlets at the dentist's office. Some important context here. The book came out in 2015, so I have to give it some leeway on things that were different back then, approximately 13,000 million years ago. Here's what YouTube looked like. Forgot about that, didn't you? Ha. I didn't. I never forget. Taking all that into consideration, the changes in humor and how graphics would have worked and how YouTube has acted, it's still pretty lame. I doubt there's a single page in the book where KSI doesn't make mention to taming his sea lion or something that is just as crude. And that's not to say that crude jokes can't be funny. A lot of the times, they are. The jokes don't come off bad or cringy because they're crude. They're just bad jokes. That's not to say that these sections are the entire book. It's most of it. There are some interesting snippets here if you really liked KSI at the time, his opinions on certain things or stories he has. That might have been interesting at the time, but now the landscape has changed considerably, making it far easier to be more personal or descriptive in your content to your audience. Basically, this book is entirely defunct thanks to KSI being on like a single podcast. As stated before, the rest of the book is just KSI's unfiltered thoughts, and let me just say, 2015 KSI didn't really have much worth saying. There is a totally not weird Build a Bay section, numerous pages for dating advice, a 2-page spread on hashtags, a 2-page spread on memes, essays that are far too long, or just FIFA stuff. I wish there was more to say about this book, but honestly that's basically it. It's a bunch of random things with juvenile humor for about 200 pages, and then it just ends. While I'm certain it existed at some point with reasons to engage with it, the book has just lost all of them. They have evaporated in the years since its release, even for the most diehard of fans, to the point where the most interesting thing about it is trying to figure out what it even is. Say what you will about Reaper's Creek. Lord knows I have. Watch the video. But at the very end, at least I understood what the book was trying to be. Several pages are just challenges, and there's big flashy colourful boxes of text, and faces, and just extremely shallow content. Like, what am I reading? Google lists the genre as humor and biographical. The first note is debatable, and the second is barely true. I imagine the age range for this is young fans, however, the ever constant use of profanities seems like it would turn away the parents. But I'm not sure how well they land for an older crowd, like me, who's ancient. I'm the crypt keeper. I described the book as having the style and content of a bunch of pamphlets, perhaps stapled together. Since then, I've come to a better understanding. It's more like if you could turn the back of a cereal box into a 200-page book. Whether that's a good thing appears to be up to you. If I had to order them, it would be like this. This is based both of what I consider to be interesting, important, or well-made literature, and my own personal enjoyment. All these books are fine. I think KSI's book is terrible and almost entirely devoid of any merit whatsoever, minus the Q&A sections, I guess. But the worst part about it is just being directionless and crude. It's a bad book in my opinion, but its existence alone isn't cause for moral concern. Like buying it doesn't put me on a watch list. Other than that, I've got nothing else to say. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.